Now, since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Western military help for Kyiv, there have been constant warnings about the risks of a direct clash between Moscow and the NATO military alliance and the dangers that that could escalate. Well, for the first time since the conflict started, there's been physical contact between the US and Russian militaries. A Russian fighter jet on Tuesday dumped fuel on an unmanned American drone in international airspace over the Black Sea and then collided with it, causing the drone to crash, according to the Pentagon. Russia has denied the two aircraft made direct contact and says the drone lost control. So was this mere reckless behaviour, as America says, or did they have direct orders to engage this US drone? Dr. Matthew Schmidt is Director of International Affairs at the University of New Haven in Connecticut in America and is a former Professor of Strategic Planning at US Army Command.
It seems most probable that this, in fact, was a deliberate attempt by the Russians to at least interfere with the drone's operations, if not to force it down.
So you regard this then as a deliberate attack on a US aircraft by a Russian aircraft?
Yes. The situation here is that you have two manned aircraft attacking an unmanned aircraft, which puts it into a strange place in sort of the rules of engagement and allows the United States to essentially avoid escalation depending on how it reacts. And that's exactly what's been going on so far. The U.S. Could escalate this, but has chosen to not do so.
Is it possible that this was one or two Russian pilots who'd perhaps overstepped the mark, that they were committing behaviour that they had not been ordered to carry out? I just wonder how disciplined the Russian Air Force is.
My read on what I've heard so far and from the Pentagon briefing is that they were trying to certainly interfere with the operations of the drone, especially the dumping of the highly corrosive jet fuel onto the drone was probably an attempt to interfere with its sensors. People need to understand that at 50,000 feet where these drones are operating, and in the area where I believe it might have been, it's able to essentially see at least half the Crimean Peninsula with extremely sensitive instruments able to track and identify targets that it's then going to pass on to the Ukrainian armed forces. The Russians do have a quite legitimate reason to be concerned. So I think this was at first at least an attempt to disrupt those operations. It may have then been an accidental downing of the drone because of pilot error, recklessness, as the U.S. has called it, but it might also have been deliberate. We just don't know based on the evidence we have. But certainly the U.S. is essentially saying that it was pilot incompetence and recklessness as a way to sort of avoid escalating the situation.
How common has it been during the Ukraine conflict so far for Russian and American or British or other Western aerial vehicles to come close or to come into almost contact with each other in the air around Ukraine?
Russian and NATO or Western forces have been operating side by side since the beginning of the conflict. I would add, since the beginning of the conflict in 2014. So there's sort of a routine that's been in place here. The Pentagon has seemed to indicate that incidents where Russian pilots are aggressively trying to interfere with drone operations has picked up in recent weeks. But again, we don't have a hard sense of what's going on.
Now, the US has summoned the Russian ambassador in Washington to make protests about this incident. But beyond that, how should the United States respond, particularly if such an incident is repeated?
I think what you might see is that the United States is going to put manned escorts up with the drones. Part of what they're doing are just presence patrols, is just to continue to assert the right of the United States and other countries to operate in international airspace over international water. And by putting manned aircraft up with the drones as they conduct their operations, it's essentially a raising of the threat to any Russian pilots who want to come in, because now you have armed American pilots who are there to defend the drone. So, it ups the ante, it escalates it a little bit, but still allows for some control because you have pilots on all sides.
You say it allows for an element of control, but it also potentially could lead to escalation, potentially significant and very serious escalation.
That's right. It could if you end up downing a jet on either side, a manned jet on either side. But what you have to hope for here is the professionalism of the pilots to avoid that happening, and their own survival instincts. Having an unmanned drone up there sort of allows for riskier behavior precisely because it's unmanned, because there aren't weapons on board that drone in most cases. When you have manned aircraft with weapons on board, everybody hopefully is going to be more cautious. And so the risk of something happening with manned aircraft in the air is actually somewhat less than it is in the situation that we've seen today.
Dr. Matthew Schmidt, this is Newsday.